Um, and yeah, it appears to have gone red. Right, okay. I am here tonight with IgorMGTOW and video games. Igor, firstly, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Been a nice day. I've been out actually. I ran 10 kilometers this morning, so a little bit tired from that, but I had a nice meal. So I've been. It's been a nicer day than the average one. But we've got a nice chat, hopefully, or interesting chat, hopefully, to go over today. Igor, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Uh, I'm Igor MGTOW. I run a MGTOW channel. I also am like one of the few MGTOWs that actually tries to do content outside of MGTOW. And I've also been part of the effort to lead the outreach to Blue Sky, which is sadly not a thing many are interested in. I've also been MGTOW since age 11, making it quite interesting in the MGTOW space.
Since age 11?
Yes, in
And do you mind me up?
2018.
In 20.
2018. Now it's
Okay,
2026.
so wow, so 8 years then, or well, nine, depending how you look at it, right? But yeah, it's a good chunk of time. Um, and so for the uninitiated, could you tell us what MGTOW is?
Uh, I already did a video called What is MGTOW, but I'll try to break it down quickly on stream so that the average layman can understand. MGTOW, as it stands as a label, is men going their own way. It describes a lifestyle philosophy that aims to build self-preservationist mindset in men and is aimed to teach men that there is an alternative to the mainstream path in life, which is marriage, relationships, and the like. And it aims to help men basically avoid all of the pitfalls that come with that, with the divorce court and family court system. It basically aims to teach men that they don't have to be married to live a fulfilling life. And that's what it is, in my view, and that's what it should be.
Okay.
It,
Well, I say the obvious, Igor. Could you not, if you don't want to get married or whatever, just not get married and leave the distinct gender separation, out? Like,
uh,
could you not?
Technically, if you wanted to, the freedom that the MGTOW philosophy gives you also applies to whether you want to call yourself MGTOW. So you could choose not to call yourself that.
Well, no, I get that. I mean, I more mean sort of like fundamentally, right? Like you could, because not everyone wants to get married, not everyone wants to have a relationship, but why um, would that be the grounds to then sort of just reject the entire premise of like any future relationship of any kind with people of different genders to yourself?
The kinds of relationships being rejected in this case are marriage and the long-term committed relationships for the purposes of not getting screwed by the system. In any case, MGTOW does not govern things like friendships or professional relationships like co-workers. So there's nothing in MGTOW saying you can't be friends with women or something like that.
But you can
Others may
see why.
disagree with,
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
but others may disagree with me, but that's at least how I see it.
You can see why someone might get confused there, though, right? Because for as much as you've just said, right, you're supposedly only rejecting marriage. The reasons behind the rejection of marriage and the supposedly flawed courts or whatever lead quite heavily into the sort of misogynistic and patriarchal attitudes that lead one to then also reject friendship with women, or indeed any idea that you'd have an equal, relation to someone. You sort of, as we'll sort of touch on shortly, the kind of narratives that a lot of people in the same space perpetuate is one that doesn't entertain any idea of male and female people being able to be compatible with each other. And so you can see why there'd be some maybe alarm bells ringing when someone reads the MGTOW label.
To be fair, the MGTOW label, one has to be honest, is kind of unpopular at the moment, and a good chunk of that is the over-focus on women as a topic, which is something I've actually tried to counter on my channel. And the reason I've tried to counter it is that I don't see focusing on women all of the time as actually being productive towards anything.
I mean, you can see why someone might think there's a focus, given that in the name it expressly, addresses only men and says that there's a need to go their own way. I mean, on your own channel, because I was having a little look, you posted an image which I might share actually, if that's all right. But essentially, it was quite it was quite clear that there's like an element of gender politics, like gendered politics, I should say, coming into it that I think would lead someone to think that it's more than just, as you say, like a rejection of marriage or whatever. Let me try
to be fair, I do not deny the idea of there being gendered politics involved, because the reason MGTOW exists is that it started off as an offshoot of the MRM, the men's rights movement and men's rights activists. So given that fact, and given that the part of the rejection is due to rejecting the family court system, obviously there's going to be some kind of gendered politics involved. And that's not exactly to say that there's no equivalent on the side of women. Look at the 4B movement. I mean, the reason I do not oppose the 4B movement on their side is because, from my perspective, to oppose the 4B movement would be hypocritical if I'm a MGTOW.
Okay, but I think the let me try and find what I was trying to pull up a second ago. Okay, I'm having a bit of an issue sharing the screen. But the image itself is, I can describe it to you. So it's a picture of a canyon or chasm of some kind. You've got a man on one side, life goals is written on the other, and then
that was me reposting a meme from someone, but the general premise of that idea is to not get distracted and to not view the attraction to women, which most of these people in the MGTOW have, which I'm fortunate to not have as much or not have at all. It's basically, they believe that they shouldn't be distracted by such things and should focus on the life goals, and that's what I would be inclined to agree with. However, I do understand why some people would think there's gendered politics involved.
I mean, but okay, I found it now that you can see. Is it going to be? There we are. You can see why someone might view an image like this, and so you can identify the somewhat misogynistic element of it, right? Because it doesn't, like, the idea of not wanting distraction in life is, I think, fairly universal, right? Everyone wants to be focused on what their goals are and such. But this positions women, 50% of the population, or roughly 50%, as what, just condenses them down to an essentialized version of their body, and then presents them as almost like inanimate and passive and somehow detrimental to men, which I don't know, I think the gendered politics there aren't just sort of incidental. There's clearly something that ties into the wider criticisms that one might have of MGTOW, which would lead back to that element of misogynistic roots and such.
To be fair, I'm going to say if I was the one making that meme, I would have framed it differently. But the thing I saw in the meme wasn't necessarily a rejection of women, it was the rejection of focusing on women, especially the kind of focus that incels do, because one of the severest disagreements I've had with the incels is their refusal to accept being single, and that's sort of the reason why I never see eye to eye on them with anything. So I would have kind of interpreted this meme as more of a shot towards the incels than towards women, but I can see why someone like you might view it as a remark on women, which is why if I was the one making it, I would have framed it differently.
Okay, I mean, you did say 100% correct there, but on the topic of incels, actually, um, is that not part of the point, right? Like, because the central problem is that they have an extremely misogynistic and warped view of relations between people, right? Like, they fundamentally don't understand that people are autonomous and should be able to exist together and don't exist just to purely satisfy someone's sexual drives, right? And so this image, in adopting the rhetoric of it by literally reducing women down to a body part, is reinforcing this patriarchal notion. And so it is, it baked into a lot of the MGTOW stuff. Because for as much as someone can make a distinction, and I'm not saying that you hold the identical views on life as an incel does, the same ideas about gender are in essence in both points. I'll reduce this back to
I
you.
mean, I mean, it's quite obvious that there are ideological differences between the MGTOW and incels, and that not everyone thinks alike. But I think in terms of this meme, it's more of an issue of framing versus the viewpoint. But one can see that that the way it's framed could be considered problematic. As for the incels, the problem they face is the entitlement they have towards women. Like, they think rejection is unfair, that being rejected by women is unfair, and that they are entitled to relationships with them. So they complain all of the time online, and that's the thing I detest because from my point of view, from what I consider the MGTOW point of view, they've been handed a golden ticket, which is being single by default. And the reason we have issue with them is because they refuse to take this golden ticket and do something productive with it.
But I mean, they they aren't like what you just said there in terms of they believe rejection is something that is endemic, and they have some their own stuff like you just said, right? But that's because they have a misogynistic and patriarchally rooted idea of relationships and sex and such, right? The idea that it's a golden ticket, I think, misses the point because it's. I mean, for one, I thought you said it was just marriage, but MGTOW opposes. Now it sounds like it's any
In
relationship, or
uh, you can choose to not be MGTOW and have a relationship if you want to, but the general viewpoint of many MGTOWs is that if you are single, you're in a better position. So it kind of boggles our minds why incels would not want that. That's what I was
well,
saying. But I'm, if I may finish, but I'm not
okay.
going to be a defender of incels on this panel. And I believe there is credible reason to call them misogynistic in every sense of the word.
Well, I'm glad because they are and such, but like the idea that it would be it's a golden ticket to be in their position, I think is like if someone wants to be single, that is fine, right? Like there's no it's not like there's any criticism of that. I think what is being criticized is the idea that it's somehow like a burden, or there's some gender like problem with having a partner, which I think leads into the misogynistic arguments that I found across incel attitudes, and I'll use incel in air quotes 'cause I don't really like the term, but also that's still present in MGTOW as well, because the idea of like someone can decide they don't want to be in a relationship, but don't want to get married, and not have this whole, oh well, relationships are the worst thing ever and they're gendered against men, and we can ignore the centuries of patriarchal attitudes and ignore the systems of power and such that exist in society. As with any, form of discrimination, I think the idea that there's somehow some like gender danger for men in being in a relationship or being in relations even, I think is a questionable one, and I think the difference between incel and MGTOW, I think, is they're different, but they borrow many of the same arguments. I think for this exact sort of point, the essentialism and the rather large overlapping misogyny that's found in a lot of those spaces.
Regarding the argument as to why MGTOWs view the ways things to do, the largest base in terms of MGTOW are those who were already in a marriage and then divorced. So their experiences in particular might lead to having such a bias, and we have to consider that most MGTOWs are people who would have already had success with women, in which case their mindset is different from the incels because that success and what happened afterwards changes their viewpoint. Like an incel, to be honest, is kind of uninformed in certain ways that MGTOWs are not. And the good thing about MGTOW, at least in the perspective that we have, is that by choosing what we choose to do, we essentially choose to believe that none of the things that would affect incels would ever be our problem again.
But sexism's not based on whether or not you have a relationship or not, right? Because there's people who don't or aren't in relationships but don't share incel positions, and there's people who are in relationships that are really misogynistic. And as you've just said, right, like there's people who take up a MGTOW position having had a relationship or having had a marriage end in divorce and such. But the theme that is criticised and should be spotlighted is the misogyny, the negative attitudes, the opinion that leads one to decide that there needs to be some divide. Like you called it the golden goose, right? Like the golden ticket.
I said the golden ticket in terms of being single, but with regards to sexism, whether or not you choose to be a sexist is your own decision, and it's not a decision I would support, because you can choose to be a sexist within a relationship, but you can also choose to not be a sexist while being single. So if you choose to mindlessly hate an entire gender, then that's entirely on you, and that's a stupid decision in my viewpoint.
Okay, and I agree with that. Sexism is silly, as is any form of discrimination, but you can see the confusion when you then call yourself MGTOW, right? Because, for better or worse, the name literally is men that go their own way, implying that there's some we must distance ourselves from this, and it is gendered because it's not as though it's like you formed a club for people that are single and want to just stay out of relationships. It's men, and you hinge it on things like, I don't know, courts and relationships and stuff, which are ultimately viewed through a heterosexual, cisgender, patriarchal lens.
Actually, that's kind of one of the things I'd like to elaborate on, because the idea that MGTOW and heterosexuality itself should be tied is one I've explicitly rejected since 2023. So when I would reject like marriage and long-term relationships, I would reject it across the board instead of doing a half-assed rejection. And the reason MGTOW itself is called men going their own way is because those who created it made it as an offshoot from the MRM, which obviously means there's gendered politics involved, and because they've made it because they believe that women in the MRM were not advantageous to the MRM, so they didn't want to share any kind of mistakes the MRM made. Now, whether or not this is the correct analysis is on you and is something to take note of, but this is the position that many MGTOWs hold.
I mean, people are fine to have an opinion on where they're sort of stemming from and such, but I mean, even there, right? Like the idea, I think the premise that it's it's not something which is just for men or whatever. It's like it is betrayed a bit by the name of the movement, for one. The fact that some MGTOWs don't share that, like you said that it's for more than just. Sorry, go over what you said again, then. Sorry, my brain
What I'm
frazzled
going
a
to
little
say
bit.
is
Sorry.
that per the label, MGTOW is for men, but what I'm saying is that MGTOW doesn't automatically give you a license to be sexist, and I do not believe MGTOW is tied to any specific sexual orientation, because doing so would betray the premise of MGTOW, and if you tie to heterosexuality, the automatic result would mean to prove that you're a MGTOW, you would have to continue basically proving that you are really into women and this or that, to the point that it would border on the term we call simping. As I oppose such a thing, I would not support any kind of effort to tie MGTOW to heterosexuality, and it's one of the biggest disagreements I've had with other MGTOWs on this.
And why do you think that is, though? Why do you think it comes up to, why do you think there's hostility to the idea of not necessarily being a cis het thing?
For regarding cis and whether or not FTM men, trans men can enter, and I do believe that they're one of us. I don't think the term men was properly defined back then when MGTOW was created, and I'm not sure if trans men were visible at the time. Now, if I was making it from scratch today, I would be very inclined to include them and integrate them, but whether or not that happened at the time is a fact of history. What I do want to say is that there are some people in MGTOW who sadly would want to use MGTOW to specifically tie it to whether or not you like women in certain ways, and as a result, whether or not you are opposed to being a pro LGBTQ plus, which is sadly the reason I've had to deal with problems, because I've consistently opposed any kind of anti-LGBTQ plus ideology and any kind of tying of MGTOW to being a right-wing or conservative, because in doing so, you kind of lose the essence of MGTOW.
So, I like. It's interesting, right? Because what you've said there makes sense, right? Like the idea that trans men would also be into men that go their own way. The idea that it would be silly to be anti-LGBTQ. I get that you think that. And what I'm asking is, why do you think so many people who come under this MGTOW label oppose this and view it in a lens of heterosexuality, view it in extremely patriarchal, sexist terms, view it in terms of all these other things you're mentioning, the discriminative, bigoted elements of it. Like, why do you think there's that element? And it's not really just an element; it's quite endemic, unfortunately, in this space.
I'm just going to say it in terms of opinions towards other communities and like the LGBTQ plus community. What I believe to have happened, and I'm not exactly an expert, is that there has been a widespread how do I put it? Basically, conservative ideology, which originally was its own thing, has basically seeped into MGTOW slowly, and basically opposition to that was basically being discouraged, to the point where if you try to make some of the MGTOW videos that existed in, say, 2015 or 2012 or something, if you try to do that in 2026, some of these people will call you gay or use slurs and the like. So basically, the sad fact is that we have to deal with a lot of tradcon sentiment that shouldn't be here, and as a result of that, we have to deal with these problems. I've had to do a lot of effort to try and somewhat reverse the tide, but I'm just one man and cannot do everything.
Well, no, what you describe is accurate, right? Like the conservative radicalization of the internet, is, the idea, the far right presence and such definitely exists, and I think that's not just in MGTOW circles; it's everywhere, right? But what I want to sort of analyze is why these elements take root in this community, and why they're able to grow quicker than, say, in other places. And I think that comes back to some of the central premises, because we're touching on, but not sort of fully probing the what it is to not just say, "Oh, I'm not in a relationship," but to actively say relationships are bad. We're going our own way as men, because it asserts, even if unintentionally, a set of premises about gender about gender, sorry, which make it clear that there's an element rooted back in those patriarchal views of men and women, and that doesn't ultimately lead to progressive attitudes, but leads to conservative ones, and thus attracts the sort of characters that do then bring in far right ideology. Like what the thing you posted, or reposted rather, the other day. The idea that a woman is just a body part that is used for reproduction, like that, is fundamentally connected to patriarchal ideas about the role of genders, with women being the for essentially reproduction and housework and raising children and little else, right? Like that is condensed into that meme, which is then reproduced through the ideology, and I think that is replicated when a movement, which ultimately, whether or not it's trying to raise points about how men are treated in various areas, does stem back to this idea that there's some division between genders, and that there's something men are owed which is lost or whatever, which then reproduces the conservative patriarchal attitude and allows people who have far right views to gain a foothold and get to the situation we're in today, where, as you've said, there's now just like a real negative sentiment towards anyone that's not explicitly conservative in a MGTOW space.
To be fair, I kind of get that, and as I've said in the meme, the problem with memes like these, and I do believe these memes have some kind of value, is that when making them, people do not consider public relations, and also the problem is, in terms of the wider manosphere, this opinion that women should have this kind of place or be sent back to their place or whatever. I just do not agree with that, because in my opinion, that's not the MGTOW mindset. Because if we were to look at MGTOW in what men going their own way would fully materialize, you cannot claim that you should want women back in the kitchen, or that women should just be serving men, or that they need to raise children or whatever, or that they're just a body part. Because in regards to cooking and cleaning and being in the kitchen or whatever, if you fully take men going their own way to its logical conclusion, then you, as a man going your own way, have to accept and understand that you also have to do all of these tasks on your own, as that's what being single would ultimately lead to. So if you believe that you shouldn't do these things and that women should do these things instead for you, you do not have the right mindset. Now, I do not understand why some people do not have this understanding, because by not having this understanding, they do not understand what MGTOW is for. So, and that's ultimately part of the problem I see with MGTOW, because I do believe, and I'm not going to say this without reason, that if conditions were to marginally improve, a good chunk of them would go back to being married and being in relationships, simply because they are conservative leaning, and because the only reason they oppose such things is the laws. So that's why that's probably why we have these kinds of opinions, and that's why I oppose them.
But is that not the point, though, right? Like, as you've just quite accurately pointed out, if they truly wanted to go their own way, they would have to start looking after themselves and such. They would have to, if they were truly to detach themselves from anything, they're going to have to suddenly all this labour, that's this housework and such, which then touches on one of the central points that is raised in criticism, the idea that the movement has fairly large connections to patriarchal ideas about women that say, yeah, you should be in the house doing all this labour for men, and the frustration comes because they are fed up with the idea that this patriarchal idea is being rejected. That that there is an expectation that they'll have to do stuff in a relationship or act in a certain way that entails breaking conservative gender norms. And as a consequence of that, I think that again touches on why there's the concern around the label. You know, it's someone can just say, "Yeah, I want to be independent and single, and you know, relationships aren't for me or whatever," and then you know, do housework and such. Because I agree, you know, everyone is capable of looking after themselves, you know, in their own way, obviously, but you know, doing housework and chores and stuff. But that doesn't mean the same thing as, you know, going your own way in a gendered fashion. And as we see, the way that many MGTOW types go their own way is by rejecting the idea that women are their equals, or you know, they're sort of people to consider in society without consideration for the impact. And so I think, I mean, Lasty in the chat says...
That's actually
sort of
a point I wanted to address. I do not think it's incelism because MGTOW actually breaks away from many of the points of incels, but in my opinion, I do believe that the opinions MGTOW as a philosophy by itself is more correct than the incelism is, because you cannot expect women to do things for you if you choose to be single and if you choose to go your own way. Which is also why I wanted to add that there's also a disconnect between MGTOW and patriarchal ideas to some extent, because in the wider manosphere, as I've seen, especially with the Netflix documentary by Louis Theroux, which I also did an entire video analysis on, which you can see on my channel, in terms of MGTOW and the patriarchy, I do not think we want a patriarchy at all, because it's not what we would want. And there's also a difference between patriarchy and androcentrism, which Liberation Y, a MGTOW YouTuber who sadly passed away, also elaborates on quite well. The reason why we would not want patriarchy is because we shouldn't have to deal with having to have influence over women or others. Why would we want that when we can simply be equal and be on our own? There's no incentive for a patriarchy. If you
But
want a
it's not...
patriarchy, if you want a
Go ahead.
patriarchy, you just want traditionalism, and traditionalism hasn't worked, because if it did, we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place.
But it's not just the idea of... It's not like patriarchy is just the idea that you're in a relationship with someone. It's also the power structure, right? Like it's the hierarchy.
I know the control where men have visible positions of power over everyone else. That's also what Liberation Y elaborated on, and that's also what would be considered patriarchy. Though I consider patriarchy and traditional conservatism to be almost synonymous with each other, because one is usually the other. Like, I haven't seen progressive patriarchy at all.
Well, it wouldn't exist, right? Like, you're not... the whole point of progressive, you know, or you know, left-wing thought and such is to remove unjust hierarchies. So gender would be one that you'd remove, which then leads us on to what we're sort of saying, right? Like, you wouldn't... It's not just, oh, you are a fan of patriarchy if you have this relation or you believe that you should be in a relationship or whatever. It's also just the idea that you would separate yourself out from people on the basis of, we're men going our own way. And then, you know, you said a second ago, you don't think women should help you and such, but it almost is a bit reductive to whittle it down to that being, you know, the decider and such. Like, you can help isn't a bad thing, and collaborating and cooperating and being in a community.
I'm not saying help is a bad thing, but the kind of expectation that you should expect women to do everything for you is what I would oppose, and it's what I would see in the areas of the manosphere outside of MGTOW, and it's kind of what I would expect from traditional conservatism. The one
there's a
good
lot
thing
of
I've
that.
seen in the one good thing I would say about the situation in MGTOW currently, as much as it isn't as great as it was in, say, 2018 or 2019, is that there is still some kind of rejection of women doing everything for you, of there being a specific place for men and women in society, and of seeking any kind of male rule over women as opposed to just going your own way. So the fact that there's this rejection means there is still hope for our side versus the rest of the manosphere.
But I mean, two things. Firstly, the fact that there is still a good chunk of people within MGTOW who would still adhere to even that part, and not just like in their own home, but sort of extrapolated across a wider stretch of society, looking at how labour is managed and who does what labour across society, but still believe in elements of, well, this labour belongs to women and such. But I also think that it's still, you know, the idea that women should not be doing things for us, we're men that go our own way, is still fundamentally rooted in some elements of patriarchal thought, because you're still organising yourself based on a gender divide that has been constructed. And I don't think that it's one that doesn't need to really exist, right? Because you could just say, you know, I want to have more independence, I don't think a relationship is right for me, without turning it into a movement that very easily gets co-opted into, you know, gets morphed into some vehicle for, as you've just said, traditional conservative ideas, right? Like, because you said yourself, you have lots of frustration with you know, elements of the communities you're in that believe all the incel stuff, right? But that's because there's massive parts of overlap between the stuff that's said. Like, even if, you know, you don't have to be wanting to be a patriarch to have elements of patriarchal discourse and conservative discourse in the logics that you use, right?
You could say that patriarchal logic can bleed into people who wouldn't necessarily want a patriarchy, but the reason I believe MGTOW as a ideological viewpoint is different from patriarchy is because we're not calling for the same things. Like, if you had a MGTOW world, it wouldn't be a patriarchy because it wouldn't be a world where men rule over women. It would be a world where men are independent from women. And thus, it would, in my view, achieve true gender equality, because then you wouldn't have to, no one would have to rule over anyone else, and we would all be autonomous from each other. So, men going their own way applied on a collective level means independence, not rule over women. So, that is also why I would reject any kind of repeal the 19th Amendment nonsense.
Well, I'm glad you think that bit's nonsense. But why would the so MGTOW is independent, but what is the loss of what is being lost by being in a relationship? May I ask? Like, because other than, you know, like, obviously, you know, you're with someone, right? That there's an element of sharing parts of your life which mean that you are having to factor in someone else, but that's just natural of any connection to anyone, right? Like, if you are on good terms with any person, then of course you are at times compromising and doing something someone else wants you to do, because that's life, right? Like, of course at some point there's going to be some collaboration, but I don't see how that's like a fundamental loss of like a healthy normal relationship. It's not a fundamental loss of independence, and so I don't see how I don't see how being in a relationship has some impact on equality. Like, I don't get it.
It's not just about independence. It's just that when I talk about true gender equality, what I mean is a completely equal footing. And I wouldn't say the excesses of radical feminism were that, or the patriarchy that existed before that are that. Because both patriarchy and radical feminism are a one-size-fits-all solutions. And we have seen in both cases that that simply doesn't work. Like, if you call for a patriarchy, you're calling for a solution that doesn't work, because if it did work, we wouldn't be in this position. And there's people who might believe, oh, true patriarchy hasn't been tried before. And I think that would be a cop-out, because patriarchy has not only been tried, it has been tried in many societies with all leading to the same result, in that it doesn't work. So that's what I would consider by the independence part. I also want to elaborate in terms of relationships. The way I would see relationships is that if you're creating a sort of a relationship that isn't a friendship, say a long-term committed romantic relationship or marriage, you're essentially creating a union, and you're just not independent if you're in part of a said union, as you do things for the interest and benefit of the union instead of doing it for yourself. So that's kind of my own personal viewpoint and maybe bias towards that. So that's why I would prefer being single, whether or not the label MGTOW is affixed to me or not.
I mean, we're going to touch on that in a moment. Like, I suppose, obviously, you just say it's your own personal opinion. Like, ultimately, if it's a relationship, then you're factored into it as well. Like, it's not as though your it's not as though your partner would be saying, well, all of your needs and wants are sidelined so that you kowtow to whatever I want. Like, it's a give and take. You both you align where you align. If you don't, then you compromise. If it doesn't work out, then you move on, right? Like, so it's not. I don't think people are like doomed to losing their independence or whatever from it. But if that's if you prefer being single, that ultimately that's a person's choice. I think the point is more in that regard anyway, that it wouldn't need to be some like big statement on society for men, especially, right? Because it's not people going their own way, it's men specifically, which is why there's that concern and criticism and such. But go ahead quickly.
If I may, I'd like to interject in that when I stated when you're creating a union, I did not specifically state that it has to be a one-sided union, but in a union where there's still give and take, it's a union. And obviously there's going to be some amount of give and take, whether that amount is the majority of the time or not varies, but there's obviously going to be some amount for the specific purpose of preserving said union. But it is still a union nonetheless. And that idea is what I would reject. But in any union, you can still have your give and take, because that's what it would, part of it would be necessary to preserve such a union.
But how would having give and take like cause equality to be threatened, or even like
on a societal level, what I would want to say is that the vision the radical feminists would have for society is not exactly one that would be conducive to gender equality, as I would feel like that it would be simply patriarchy, but in reverse. So that's what I was talking about.
I feel, I mean, for one, the adjective radical and the noun feminist are very broad. Like, I feel like it means a lot of different things in different places. But on the whole, I think people trying to, bring about gender equality are very much not looking for the opposite version of patriarchy, right? Like, it's in layman's in layman's terms, they're just looking to critique and replace the ways that old ideas from patriarchy still exist in today's society.
If I may add, that's also the reason why specifically always affix radical before feminist, because there's a reason why I never just broadly say feminist when discussing this, because I have interacted with people before who call themselves feminists because they believe in gender equality. And a good chunk of radical feminists, what they usually mean by that, when I see that, is what others call trans-exclusionary radical feminists. So these types of people are basically the core of what I would determine radical feminists, and the slightly more progressive ones who believe in mostly similar things are like the outer shell. But usually radical feminists behave in much of the same way that J.K. Rowling would behave, in my opinion. I assume you know who she is, given the things that she does with trans people.
Yeah, awful person.
Not disputing that.
But no, I think that you are quite right in that the TERFs or whatever, they're clearly like quite awful, but they are co-opting a term to push anti-LGBTQ stuff. Like they aren't, I would say, representative of the average person calling themselves a feminist, they
I
like.
do. I specifically do not state that they're representative of the average feminist, which is why I always have the distinction between feminist and radical feminists. Moreover, one could also just as easily make the argument that they're not representative of the radical feminist space itself, given that you have trans-inclusive radical feminists who would probably be just as equally powerful as the trans-exclusionary base, if not slightly more numerous.
Well, that's why I think it's important to be critical and sort of thinking about how the word radical is used, right? Because what I was sort of trying to say a second ago with in regards to patriarchy, like the idea that sort of tying these things together, the idea that it doesn't work is obviously true. It's not a good way to organize society, but in some ways it's a power structure. And so if you are the person at the top of a structure that has decided that half the population don't need to be paid and don't get to vote and exist only to have kids and do housework, it does work because it keeps you in power, which then leading back to what we're thinking about is
But
the
it
reason.
but it doesn't represent the other 50% of the population that
Oh, of
would need
course.
representation, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
why, in my opinion, doesn't work.
Oh,
cannot
I
have a
agree.
You cannot have a power structure that is not representative of a significant chunk of the population, which is why I do not believe one-size-fits-all solutions work.
And I agree. Like, I'm no fan of patriarchy. I wasn't trying to like say yes, this is the best system. My point is more that understanding it I think, involves reflecting on structures of power, hierarchies and such. And so, the idea that someone is believing in patriarchy or holding patriarchal values because of some error or because they are an incel or whatever, or even just or MGTOW or whatever. Like it's not contingent on like a logical point of view. It's a power relationship, and so someone can believe in it, even knowing that, as we do, that it's a bad way to organize society, and then also call themselves MGTOW and such. In the same way that, like the so-called radical feminists and such, like because radical just it could be radical to depart from the structures which we've been used to for so long, and many of them are bad structures. In this case, the radical is being co-opted by people with a clearly harmful agenda, but that shouldn't mean that we disown the idea of being radical, right? Because there are things that
Generally, I should have been more forthcoming and specific when I say it, but usually I kind of use the term radical feminist to be synonymous with female supremacist. And I've seen TERFs act in exactly that way, but I do not believe opposing a system that would have injustice and pushing for a better one, no matter if it's seen as radical by proponents of such a system, is necessarily a bad thing.
yeah, like I don't. I think TERFs aren't necessarily like purely female supremacy. They certainly are gender essentialist. They have ideas about the body and about gender which are pseudoscientific and essentially treat it as though it's some like ingrained innate thing, which ironically is very similar to what people who believe in conservative ideas about patriarchy and such do. They also are certainly in the modern age very much just funded by fascists and funded by people with a far right agenda about the body and such.
May I elaborate on one point?
Yeah, of course.
Matt Walsh wanted to actively work with TERFs in terms of defeating transgenderism or whatever, and I think I have a screenshot of that saved somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where, but I have it.
It wouldn't surprise me.
He obviously decries that, oh no, TERFs rejected him or whatever. But he did say that he wanted that, and he also said that it would be like siding with Stalin to fight Hitler or something. That's how he described it.
It wouldn't surprise me. They both. I think there's clearly overlap between fascism and the stuff that TERFs say, and especially if you are belonging to like a a trans identity, intersex, anything like that, then you're in the crosshairs of both groups, and so there's no they're clearly both awful groups. But the point that I'm trying to make is that whilst TERF ideas don't fit the ideas of feminism really, because one, like you're not actually interested in gender equality or deconstructing bad hierarchies. You're just trying to use terms to attack LGBTQ people. The reason I think there's still that scrutiny for MGTOW stuff is because there's no like the reason feminists would call themselves feminists is to identify the long-standing sexism in society. Whereas the ideas that you've said about like independence could apply to anyone, regardless of your gender, right? Like a woman could also say, well, I don't want to have this dependence on someone else. I want to have my independence and not be beholden to anyone. So my confusion then would be why you would need the men part. You could just have people go their own way.
Usually, that's an argument I've heard before, but it's one that would be easily explained by the existence of the 4B movement, which is the feminist and female equivalent of MGTOW. Now, I'm not opposed to that because to be opposed to that would also be hypocritical because you would support MGTOW, but then not support the existence of the equivalent of it. But I wouldn't necessarily scrutinize 4B movement for being female-oriented or female-only for the same reason I wouldn't scrutinize MGTOW. But in terms of why MGTOW is scrutinized, I cannot exactly say that scrutiny is unwarranted, given that the behavior of some people within the community have led to the arguments of the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that they are making sounding correct. For example, I basically have to defend the idea that MGTOW isn't anti-LGBTQ+. And every time some stupid guy does something that is anti-LGBTQ+, I basically feel sabotaged in that regard because then I cannot prove that and I look stupid.
Igor, really sorry to interrupt you. Your audio just went very funny then. Are you fine to unplug and then plug back in your headphone or something? It just went...
It's a Bluetooth headphone, but just so I know, is there a problem?
It went just a bit funny then all of a sudden. I don't know if anyone in chat heard that, but it sounded a bit distorted just then.
Does it? I must have clicked something on the taskbar, but I'm just going to ask: is this problem still happening like right now, or was it only momentarily?
I think it was momentary. I think it sounds now. But,
in that case, I think I wouldn't need to replug.
Yeah, no, it sounds good now. Yeah, it sounds fine. So yeah, what you were saying, sorry, you were saying something about I heard bits of it. You were saying you said in the past that MGTOW can be MGTOW isn't anti-LGBTQ.
Because from the standpoint of interests, we have basically zero reason to oppose them. There's basically almost 0 points of contention, so there is basically zero reason to oppose them. Nothing that they would do would, in my opinion, harm us, and nothing that we would do, provided that we aren't being influenced by conservatism, would harm them. As in, we can coexist and even work together on common interests. But sadly, that is not the viewpoint that these conservative-leaning MGTOWs would want to believe in. The problem with them is that there is a reason, basically to describe it, some of them would want to abandon the wider aspirations of MGTOW just so that they can have a free pass on hating LGBTQ+ people. And it is that kind of attitude that I do not like, because they're not effectively working for the betterment of all of us men if they are just using it as an excuse to be bigoted towards minority groups.
Then I would ask again, like, why do you think that these conservatives latch on to MGTOW?
Because in the past, when the conservatives, in my opinion, didn't outright screw MGTOW over, there was a common ground between MGTOWs and conservatism in that SJW and woke one stuff was opposed, as it's seen now, and in that the excesses of feminism were also opposed. So back then, you can see alignment between conservatives and MGTOWs because as much as they had different ideologies, they tended to have similar enough interests in that they had similar enemies.
But then
However,
let's talk
I'd
about
argue,
that. Go ahead, Si. Finish what you're
uh,
saying, Si.
actually, you can go ahead because you wanted to elaborate on a point.
Yeah, you said about SJWs, and I've written that with air quotes around it, quotation marks. You said there's a common
I wouldn't
interest.
I wouldn't use that term now, but in the historical period, that was the term used to describe progressive people and some of the excesses of the woke one era, which is basically progressivism before 2020.
So then let's critically analyze that. Because I remember that 10 years ago or so, I remember SJW being a term used quite a lot. What was the sort of common ground that MGTOWs and conservatives might have had or had in this time? I suppose you were there as well. What was the common ground?
At, at the time period, we basically thought of these people as a norm and didn't like the fact that they basically sided with the people we would have called radical feminists, and we didn't like the fact that they were against us. Now, with the understanding we have now, I'd say part of the issues with MGTOW is PR and framing, but back then, one would say that that wasn't exactly considered. So
So what was
we basically believed that the conservatives and even the Trump supporters were closer to us than the progressives were, even when in reality, with hindsight, that wasn't actually the case. So we just didn't like. So MGTOW as a whole didn't just like the SJWs, and I'd say the feeling was mutual on their end towards us.
so? I think you touch on something quite important there, right? Like you can recognise that it was a mistake to be around all these conservative Trump types, and that the animating factor in a large way was one of the animating factors for a lot of people was the supposed annoyance held and the dislike held for so-called SJWs. I would then, to unpack this further, what is it that you would say was the annoying thing? What is it that is causing the wanting someone to step towards Trump supporters and just open fascists and stuff? The common ground you said, like what actually is it that is making someone stand with people that you don't even necessarily agree with?
Basically, progressives have always historically had a more favorable attitude towards feminism and even radical feminism. And I'm not going to say that that is necessarily a bad thing, because if you like gender equality, that's kind of a good thing. But in terms of that, just as they had favoritism toward feminism, there was also a slight dislike towards the MRM. Now that is dependent on what the MRM was doing and their ideology and any potential overlaps with other segments of the manosphere. But because such an enmity existed, MGTOWs were often labeled as part of the manosphere, would look to basically view it as, if you don't like the progressives and feminists, and if there's also this other group that doesn't like that, naturally you would want to sort of work together, even though siding with conservatism is one of the stupidest decisions you can make, because while progressives and feminists weren't exactly friends of MGTOW, and I don't think they still are, as much as that there are differences, the one thing I'm going to say that is that they're honest. The tradcons, I would say, is that they would try to appeal to you. They would try to basically appeal to your kind of best interests, and in the end, they would basically screw you over by basically co-opting you into doing whatever it is that they like. But sadly, that's not something that was actually noticed by many of these people. They they believed they could fight off the overt enmity from the progressives and even radical feminists, but they weren't aware of how tradconism actually works and how easily you can be co-opted. One of the amazing things I've seen about the feminists and their side of the thing is how they somehow managed to resist a complete co-opting by TERFs, which is what I keep looking at, because I try to figure out if we could just as easily resist being co-opted by tradcons.
Well,
So that's
you touch on a really important point again. I think it sort of echoes what we were saying earlier. There's a fundamental problem in left-wing circles with what TERFs say, because if you're going on about how trans people aren't real and stuff, that doesn't help break down injustice. That perpetuates it. That reinforces cis heteronormative gender essentialist ideas about the body, and that sort of stuff isn't actually left-wing. It's not breaking down any unjust power structure or hierarchy or idea. Whereas the MGTOW stuff and I think you say men's rights movement. I think I
kind of say it because it's important to acknowledge it, because MGTOW effectively started off as an offshoot of it, even if it has been its own thing for years. So I always add that as a sort of context, and also to explain why the men part in MGTOW exists.
Yeah, no, I can see the root, but the reason there's criticism for that is because there's already the idea that patriarchal ideas also hurt men is not like a new one or profoundist. It's just obvious, right? Like the idea that there's fixed laws about how gender should be between people is clearly one that's going to hurt everyone, even though even as one group is put over the other in the wider sort of context of society. And so there's a fair amount of doubt when a movement arises calling itself a men's rights movement, because it, for one, even in the name, sort of implies that there's some innate gender disadvantage for men and ignores elements of the patriarchal side of things. And two, is again naturally going to attract bad faith actors that are only really interested in muddying conversations about how to improve society and turn it into, haven't women's rights gone too far? Men need this, that, and the other. Especially when it's over things which, when a more critical lens is applied, are literally other productions of the patriarchy and patriarchal ideas. And so
there's one expression I have in that, while I can see that the patriarchy is gone, that some of its ghosts still remain. So that's kind of the way I have looked at things. You can see the main patriarchy is gone, but a lot of its legacy still lingers onwards.
Yeah, because it's a social structure, isn't it? It's not as though it's literally like a dark room where people are writing down, oh yes, this is how we're going to make patriarchy today. It's social, legal, cultural, economic. It's in many forms. It's connected to capitalism. It's connected to how we just interact and talk. And so because of that, it's more complicated than just flicking a button and undoing some law or whatever. And so also as a consequence of that, the idea that a men's rights group would also be able to just flick switches and improve things, I think loses some of the point, which is why a large part of that is not interested in actually achieving any kind of justice for people, and instead it focuses on the sort of sexist, misogynistic, anti-feminist stuff that just comes to dominate a lot of the conversation. And then why the same thing is replicated with MGTOW, which people like yourself who want to try and talk about things end up, just firstly drowned out by a sea of just awful voices, and then also secondly replicate some of the negative stuff themselves, as we saw, because you said you were critical of that image earlier, but things like that do ultimately replicate stuff, right? So I think there's, going back to what I was saying, the reason I think there's the a less successful rejection of co-option by bad faith elements calling themselves feminists or calling themselves MGTOW or whatever is because one draws from a rejection of unjust hierarchies, the other sustains it through how it structures itself and how it approaches its discourse, and therefore attracts all the people that also want to just maintain it anyway, namely conservatives and fascists and all the rest of it.
If that is the issue, then what I would say the issue is how MGTOW presents itself and PR, which is why, in terms of videos and everything, I see PR and the way you present is extremely important, because the way you present something is obviously going to influence people, and it's obviously going to influence what kinds of people co-opt the idea that you want people to co-opt. So there is a reason why I, for example, wouldn't do the kind of meme that I reposted if I was the one designing it myself, even if you can agree with what it was trying to say. And for example, there's also the reason why I have basically every incentive to reject any kind of misogyny, because first I've started to suspect that misogyny and transphobia are somehow connected, and in which case it would be advantageous for us to reject it instead of accept it. And secondly, because it wouldn't actually help me now. I believe that all of the successes MGTOW has been in spite of misogyny and those kinds of statements, and not because of it.
Sorry, the last part. I'm just going to quickly. Like, my audio was being a bit strange again. Hold on, give me a moment. I'm just going to quickly remove and add you again to the call. Ready?
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Try speaking now again. Could you say something quickly?
Test. Does it work better?
Yes, it does now. Brilliant. Apologies. Would you be able to say the last few sentences just again quickly for me? Sorry.
And basically, like I said before, in terms of misogyny and its connection to transphobia, that's one thing I was suspecting. But the second thing is, I believe it's disadvantageous to MGTOW, and it would make us look bad in terms of optics, which is why PR is everything. And also because I believe that all the successes MGTOW has had in terms of its growth has been in spite of such sentiment and not because of it. I don't think these people and that sentiment have helped us. And we have had our success in spite of such sentiment and not because of them. Because if such sentiment didn't succeed, we would have even more success. So I believe this kind of sentiment is counterproductive to any kind of aims we would have.
But like you talk about optics and such, but I mean it is right in the name, right? Like the M in MGTOW is gendered in a way that is going to invite people that do believe in some kind of gender hierarchy. And so, for as much as you reject misogyny, there's you say you reject misogyny, you still play into a connection to patriarchal ideas, which is going to have those people show up, especially when it's like it's all framed in language which is identical to the stuff that conservatives say, or the same idea just from a different angle, right? Like, because the person that says, the courts are biased, there's legal things, relationships are taking away independence and such, ultimately all stem from the idea that women have somehow gained too much, or have got some advantage, and there's something to be gained in cutting them off from relationships and such. And
what I would basically say is that while you can say that wait, am I echoing or something? Because I am hearing you.
You sound fine to me.
Because I can hear myself. Actually, it's better now. I'll continue. Basically, while you can say that all of those facts, and you can say that they're true in terms of the analysis, you cannot 100% solely blame women for it, even if they are kind of the group that would be able to take advantage of this, because half of the voter base is men. So you can say that men did vote for such systems, and that any kind of advantages women would have in divorce courts could also be stemmed from the idea that women were not seen as people who could sustain themselves, so you would obviously need some kind of safety net for them. Now in a modern understanding, that would be false because women have jobs and everything and can quite easily sustain themselves. But in the past, where you have patriarchal assumptions that women should be in the home and men should work, that kind of framing would allow for things like alimony and child support and all of the other stuff. So you could also make the argument that the fault of the way no fault divorce is set up in its current form, not that it in itself is a bad thing, it stems from the idea and the ghosts of a previous idea where you believe that women should be in the home and men should be working. I hope that makes sense.
It does, but like even that explanation, I think, is still because, like you say, there is clearly there are ideas lingering from the legacy of patriarchy as more concretely experienced, which inform our courts and such today. But I don't think it's quite as there's a female advantage in divorce courts, and there's more power, and there's more to lose and such.
I'm not going to say that there is an inherent 100% female advantage, but what I can say is that it can happen more often, and that avoiding that would still be a good idea. Now, the reason I cannot say that it is inherent and 100% intentional is because you can just as easily have a case where, let's say, a woman is the breadwinner and man has less money, and then the courts give the man alimony or something to compensate. That can still happen in this kind of a system, but whether women benefit from that is more of a case of happenstance than versus an intentional system, because per intent, as far as I'm aware, they're supposed to advantage the person with the lesser income, regardless of who that person is.
But that those scenarios, I think, are surely better analysed through the lens of economics and such as well, right? Because the reason we have these concerns and such, and the reason there's all this fuss, is because like raising kids costs money in a capitalist society where we don't have we're expected to pay for the things we need to survive and such. There's a requirement for people to produce this money from somewhere, and so breadwinners and who earns more and who's in charge of the child all mix in with the gender stuff to produce outcomes that say, well, this person needs to give X amount to their other, their former partner or whatever. I don't think that is quite the same thing as that like there being a danger in like the idea that there's if you are in a relationship, you may potentially get divorced and have an unfavourable settlement in court. Like, I don't think that's particularly a reason enough to make an entire movement that only, as you've just said yourself, right? Like, it's not as though the judge is going to look at, oh, this person is a woman and therefore they are going to need the better half of a divorce settlement. Like, it's very much not the case, and in fact studies sort of have shown that there are still quite blatant misogynistic elements in courtroom rulings and scrutiny placed on mothers and such. And that isn't to say that it's there's not issues for some men and such, because of course there are. There's a system built on bad and flawed ideas is of course going to have problems happen to people, but I don't think it's sensible to then turn that into like, oh, men avoid relationships with women avoid relationships because you will avoid this unfair system later, because it implies that the patriarchal problems are reversed, and that it's some like nefarious female conspiracy, which then leads into all the right-wing, far-right talking points about, oh, women's rights have gone too far and such. Like, and even if it's not believed by people like yourself, it still allows the ammunition to be put into the guns to then kickstart other conservative arguments and talking points.
Before I state my main argument, I'm going to state that if you've if what you've seen is this kind of society, and if you as a man feel disadvantaged by it, then the slightly low effort arguments by the conservatives of how things would be better for men if you just went back in time would seem a very appealing if you have those kinds of beliefs. But it's also a thing that one should reject because it uses low effort arguments and going back in time to traditionalism just doesn't work. However, what I would also like to mention is that just because there isn't any intentional bias in terms of oh, we should give women a settlement that's more beneficial just because they're a woman, you cannot realistically deny that there is a trend, and that trend affects one party beneficially and affects the other party not beneficially. However, that trend doesn't necessarily have to be a nefarious conspiracy or something, and it doesn't mean that there's some kind of secret shadowy cabal that intentionally tries to fix things for one side at the expense of the other. So that's what I would add to that. And the reason avoiding such a and the reason why avoiding marriage is appealing is, in addition to all of the benefits of being single, you would avoid being a part of that trend. However, there's also these kind of low effort and childish ideas that, oh, everything will be fixed if we remove no fault divorce or something, and that's just not how it works. If you remove no fault divorce, you basically make it impossible to leave a marriage or make it very hard. What you can do is keep no fault divorce, remove alimony, or if you need something like that, actually trade alimony for something like a universal basic income. That might sound a bit like Andrew Yang or Zoltan, but I'd still feel like a universal based income would be, for everyone, would still be far better in terms of achieving the goals of what alimony would want versus a selective alimony system.
I mean, again, there's a lot of sensible stuff there, but equally, I think, I mean, just rewinding slightly, like for as much the benefits of being single exist, sure, but there's also, I think we are also missing through this, but there are like reasons someone might want to be in a relationship which aren't like
I don't
bad
deny
ones,
said
right?
reasons. I do not deny said reasons, and I do not deny that you could believe that there are benefits in relationships, because if you're inclined to want that, you can obviously see the benefits of being one versus being single, but it's more so my bias to like being single. However, in terms of being single being used as purely a strategy to avoid the general trend of the court system, even if that trend is not intentionally fixed by some shadowy cabal of those who are anti-men or something, it is still effective. So that's what I mean. However, just because a
Also,
trend
go ahead,
so,
sorry.
however, just because a trend exists doesn't mean that there's always a shadowy cabal behind it. Not everything is like this QAnon level, deep state is everywhere type of conspiracy.
Yeah, but like it's. I also think as well, courts aren't. Courts as an institution, right? Like they're not funded properly. They have tons of cases. They have a massive backlog, and so these things influence as well the decisions that are made, which I also don't think aren't. It's not as though like it's the norm for someone to go into court and just be bankrupted by a divorce. And plenty of people divorce perfectly amicably and are on good terms. It's not like, I think it's itself a bit of a misogynistic, like a patriarchal stereotype, a religious infused stereotype, a conservative, that's what I'm looking for, conservative stereotype that divorce is some like tragedy that's going to just instantly wreck a family and ruin someone's life. And like, it's also just as often the case that people divorce and move on with their lives, and payments are made because they need to raise kids or whatever, and it's done.
That is also true, and part of the reason why I do not believe divorce is a tragedy is because I don't necessarily like the institution of marriage itself, which is also why I look at the no-fault divorce as not something that should be removed, like the conservatives would want, but rather something that could be amended, because you could still have no fault divorce, do everything it needs to do, including allow women or men to leave easily if they want to without having to prove a fault, but remove every single part that would actually cause anyone who is for men's rights activism and MGTOW to hate it. You can have perfectly working no fault divorce and remove basically every single reason why it would be opposed, because it is the economics of the things that are opposed versus the no fault divorce itself. Now, this might get me flack with the conservatives, but I do not believe no fault divorce itself is a bad thing, and that I believe it can be made better. Moreover, like I said before, if I was given the opportunity to trade say selective alimony or child support for universal basic income, something that Andrew Yang believes in and something that Zoltan Mamdani might be inclined to believe in, I would be more than happy to make such a trade.
Well, yeah, no, I think that in a, as you just said, right, in a system where we were not reliant on money to pay for things and to to access our basic needs and such, and if there weren't massive economic disparities, yeah, you wouldn't need to have such a system, to ensure that partners were given restitution and such. We obviously do live in one currently at the moment, and so that's why it exists.
Yeah,
And I also
yeah,
think as
but
well that there is something to be said about like when you've got other parties involved too, kids and such. There is an importance in making sure they are if they're with their caregiver and they're getting like a fraction, then obviously that's not right either. But these aren't things, I don't think, which are like I don't think this points to a female advantage. I think, as you've just said yourself, right, the economics are the driving factor, and because more childcare is like childcare is still, even though we've had lots of gender equality, we're closer to gender equality than we were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, etc. It is still gendered, and it is still predominantly something which is expected of the mother. That influences why the decision happens. So why it the trend you spoke of earlier may occur, which I'll stress again isn't like a rule of thumb or even like as dominant as some like to claim. And
also,
so
I'd like to add on that point. I also believe such a thing could be resolved if more initiative is taken to pursue childcare versus offloading it onto the mother. Because if you were to do such a thing, instead of you having to pay child support, the child support would flow towards you, because then you would be taking up custody and all of that. So I also believe, where possible, things like the tender years doctrine and primary custody to the mother should be more replaced by 50-50. And on the part of men itself, more initiative should be taken to ensure that such a thing were to happen, because you shouldn't want to give up on your child or something just because you are divorced. And I don't believe that men would necessarily. I don't want to say that that most men are deadbeat dads, because they're obviously not. But I do think that more initiative can be taken, but it obviously requires cooperation with such a system, and basically removal of any kind of bias, such as the tender years doctrine, where primary custody should be given to the mother because of XYZ factor, which you, from your own framing, could just as easily say is a remnant of the patriarchy.
well, yeah, there's no. I agree with the idea that it wouldn't automatically be one or the other. Like in a just society, there wouldn't. You would evaluate who is better suited. I also think that the idea that we would raise, like the idea that you need two, the idea that it would just be two people, like husband and wife, isn't necessarily a given. Like is again a patriarchal formation of relationships. It doesn't have to be that way forever. But going back to what you said, as you've said, firstly, like the economics are the driving factor in all of this. You suggested paying for child custody and stuff like that isn't custody support and stuff like that. Again, is another economic thing. People haven't got the economic needs to raising a child costs money, far too much money to do by yourself most of the time, unless you've got a very high earning position. So you need the support of another person to raise a child. Hence the payments that might be made by someone. So again, a critique of economics and the capitalist structure of the working world, rather than the gender situation in court and such. But secondly, and it just keeps coming up to me, like, why? Because the points you're making, a lot of them, there's a lot to agree with, right? I don't understand why this then has to be like wrapped under the MGTOW thing. Like, I don't see why this can't just be like, hey, we'd rather be single. We've got critiques of the system as it exists. We're fine with all the other stuff, but we personally have chosen to be single. I don't see why that then needs to be like this is the best way for men to go. Like, I think that is the contention. Like, why do these critiques of our system, which many of which aren't that unreasonable, need to then be tethered into like language and framing that invites all the patriarchal stuff that you don't even agree with to then come back in and start dictating your movement and such.
I wouldn't necessarily say MGTOW is a movement, but what I would say is that many of these critiques of the system, as well as of relationships and marriage and how it would work, are primarily experienced by a particular demographic, and that particular demographic would want to advocate for its own interests, which I do not necessarily see as a bad thing, given that women are doing almost the same thing with the 4B movement, which basically hold many of the same no marriage, no long-term relationships things that MGTOW holds, but just for women.
But do you see the difference in sort of the power difference, right? Because one, sure, in the sense that both are groups of largely the same gender saying we should keep to ourselves, but one, because of the nature of patriarchy, one of those groups is a bit different to the other because it's, it's a group that is coming from the societal power versus one which is not. So it's a little bit different, I think. Especially as, when we look at sort of the wider trends, the 4B movement I don't think is particularly prevalent in left-wing spaces or circles. I don't think it's like a thing, whereas
I know it's mostly a thing in South Korea and in terms of feminist circles there.
Yeah,
but
and I think it's also like
it's very similar to, and because it's very similar to how we work in terms of MGTOW, and because it exists as sort of mirror for it, I basically never attack it or criticize it.
But it's one is a fierce criticism of of genuinely unjust things, like ultimately patriarchy and patriarchal ideas are real things which have really tangible impact and such. Whereas as you've said yourself earlier, large parts of the manosphere and people who call themselves MGTOW and such essentially just believe in the conservative patriarchal ideas, which can be essentially heard espoused by current far-right leaders, some of whom are in government, right? So, I think there is a bit of a difference. And I also think that for as much as, like you said, of course men will advocate for themselves, the gender divisions don't need to exist because, I'm a man and I advocate for my, things that I want better in my life and such, right? But I don't base it on, my gender. I want it for everyone. So I don't see the need for it to be I want, if people want to be in relationships, that's fine. If they want to be single, that's fine. People should ultimately have the freedoms to live their life, as freely as they can, right? But I don't see why that needs to be sculptured around a particular agenda. I'd also say, by the way, that it's coming up to 90 minutes of this stream, and whilst it's very interesting, we may head to a conclusion within the next sort of 5-10 minutes, if that's.
I don't think we've discussed all of the topics because there's like the last topic you didn't necessarily get into, that we didn't get into for the sake of time. But I would be more than happy to hold additional streams with you if that's what you would want.
Yeah. I'm just saying it's. Oh, sorry.
I also would say that in this stream, while we do have different framings and viewpoints on things, we largely sort of agree on there being several core issues and why said issues exist. So it's not like a debate groping where one is against each other. There is
Well,
a lot of agreement that was reached here.
Yeah, no, there's clearly like it's common ground and such. I think that's sort of why the and certainly we don't do debate. I wouldn't have debate bro stuff on my channel and such. My point, there's still time to discuss stuff. I was just saying to be conscious of time and such. But no, my point is more just like it's if we can. I mean, certainly if like you can see the because from what you're saying, like as you say, there's a lot of stuff that I don't think is that disagreeable, and there's plenty of stuff I would actually agree with. I just don't see the need for the framing of, especially as well, because like whilst I get what you're saying about wanting to push away the like traditional conservative patriarchal stuff and get rid of some of the like just open bigots who seem to just be in these spaces. I don't see why you might not just say instead, well, do we actually need this particular framing? Maybe there's a different term we can use, but it doesn't have quite the same gendered element to it. And, maybe go from there, right? Because in my eyes, part of the issue is when I read MGTOW, I'm thinking of all the just awful, like, sexist weirdos who just have terrible views, and that's largely because of the voices that are shout loudest in those spaces. I don't see why, if the gendered stuff was taken out of it and you were sort of just saying, oh, well, we're like, I think the other thing that gets me a little bit concerned is the idea that like it's more you get more independence or liberation or whatever from being single, which I think it depends on who you are. Like some people would prefer to be single, some people want to be in a relationship. Like, it doesn't really matter.
It's kind of my personal viewpoint, but it does have MGTOW influence. And regarding the framing, what I would want to say is that I see feminism, and many MGTOW see feminism as not just a push for equality, but basically something that advocates for the interests of women. Now, others see that as a bad thing, but I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing because I think there should be advocacy for women's interests, but I also think there should be advocacy for our own interests. This is why I wasn't necessarily opposed to the gender framing, because I believed feminism already has that, and I had zero qualms with it because of such a framing. Like I'm not opposed to them basically advocating for women's interests, because the MRM and the MGTOW would have advocated for men's interests. So that's why, while others think it's bad for feminism to have a woman-centered viewpoint, I don't think it's bad.
Well, even with that, like, because under this current structure we're in and such, of course we've got like different groups advocating for their own interests and such, and that makes sense in the sense that, like, if patriarchy exists, then the group that is pushed to the bottom of patriarchy will advocate for their needs. If racism exists, then groups that are at the bottom of, racialized negatively will advocate for their needs. But what ideally would move to is one where, because ultimately my needs and your needs, despite whatever differences exist between us, are ultimately the same, right? We're both human, but we both need to eat and sleep and drink and whatever. So we have the same needs, and the same applies. Obviously, we're both men, right? But the same thing ultimately applies really with gender. I don't think the differences are concrete or anything. Like they're just things that exist because of our social organization. And so to sort of link it to what we're saying, the reason feminists call themselves feminists isn't because they believe the feminine is superior, but because that's the
I
framework
wasn't
patriarchy.
saying I wasn't exactly saying that, but I did say that from our viewpoint, they advocate for the interests of women, which is also not tied to femininity, because you can have, just as you can have feminine men, you can also have masculine women and also have masculine men and feminine women. Stuff like that.
Yeah, of
Like
course, but
whether or
like,
not you're feminine or masculine is not influenced by what gender you are a part of.
of course, but the thing that would make one masculine or feminine is
It's also kind
constructed,
of a
isn't it?
social
Like,
it's also kind of a
yeah,
social contract. Like I would get that, because different societies have different societal expectations and viewpoints of what is feminine and masculine. And incidentally, like the first document that calls MGTOW by name said something like, "Oh, make women masculine, feminine, make men masculine," and call for government and something like that. But that document is so old, I'm not sure how applicable that is. And I also did like a survey on my channel on if that is something that is believed in, and most of my viewers voted against gender norms and any kind of gendered expectations. Like on women being feminine, they voted like on instilling femininity in women. My subscribers voted overwhelmingly against such a thing, and in terms of instilling masculinity in men, they also voted with a clear and wide margin also against that. So gender norms and traditional gender norms aren't exactly popular, at least in my corner.
well, no, I think that it's not to be that surprised, not too much of a surprise, right? Most people don't want to live how things were 150, 200 years ago, or whatever, right? Like, despite what some conservatives think and say, people are not that conservative. Um, my point was more that whilst there is we can see why people advocate for different identities. Especially when it comes to gender, I don't think there's a need to like, especially in terms of men, and like we wouldn't need to keep pushing just on a strict gender path. Like we ultimately want to break down the gender barriers and have people being able to relate to each other out all the sort of nonsense that stops them from just being able to talk and
I don't believe advocacy for one group of people or your own group of people necessarily implies any kind of gender war or being unable to relate to another group of people. Like, for example, there's this discussion on where men and women can be friends. I've made
well, of
it
course they can, but
myself I've made myself very explicit in the fact that I believe that men and women can be platonic friends, which is a position that some heterosexual people of both genders somehow think it's not possible, and that it relies on trust. But it's kind of interesting how I seem to be in the minority, not in terms of MGTOW, but in terms of overall, in believing whether men and women can be friends and believing that yes, indeed they can.
well, again, that's the legacy of patriarchal attitudes. The idea that there's some, innate, the idea that men and women are only able to relate via the means of, a relationship or whatever, being married or whatever.
Uh,
But
Actually, the sorry to interrupt, but there is a really good term that the LGBTQ plus community has for this. It's called allonormativity and amatonormativity. Now, the very interesting thing is that we MGTOWs would have noticed the exact same things, but we would have used different terms for it. For example, amatonormativity means the pushing of romantic relationships and marriage as the standard, but we would call something like that like pro-gynocentric propaganda or something like that, despite two different communities noticing the exact same thing but using very different terms to describe it. The same social phenomenon but different terms to describe it.
yeah, no, I suppose, but like my point was more, well, not suppose, like it was, what was it? So what was I just saying?
I hope my interjection didn't make you forget.
No,
Sorry if
no,
I
it wasn't.
interjected.
No, 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 it's fine. It's fine. It was interesting. It's just late in the UK, so it's just 1:15 in the
Actually,
UK.
it's the second hour of the day in Serbia and 17 minutes.
I have no excuse then. What was I saying? It was what were you saying? What was I saying just before? It was
I've basically, in the argument, I basically suggested that two different communities can see the same social phenomenon and have vastly different terms to describe it and conclusions they derive from it. Now, the things that we in MGTOW noticed, the LGBTQ plus community also noticed, but they call it allonormativity and amatonormativity, which is the expectations that romantic relationships and marriage are good for everyone and that each should be promoted. And the asexual and aromantic corner of the LGBTQ plus community, they're really good at noticing these kinds of things. But it's something we MGTOWs have also noticed. It's just that we've had very different terms to describe it, and the average MGTOW, which would also include myself at that point, because that's how I used to describe it, we would have described such a thing as gynocentric or something.
okay. Yeah, so I can see. Yeah, that. Thank you for the refresher. Sorry. So, can you see the difference though in the two expressions? Because one describes, as you've just said, right, like the noticing of society's push towards, the sort of cis heteronormative relationship model, which not everyone's going to fit under, and so people say, "Oh, I'm aromantic, I'm asexual, I'm not fitting this model," but that isn't inherently gendered because anyone can be asexual or aromantic. It just describes not being invested in having a romantic or sexual partner or whatever. Whereas the other takes that and puts it through a gendered lens, which then invites the discussion of why is it only why is it this group, why is it linked to all these other arguments. I think it's not like a single this is the reason why MGTOW is raising an eyebrow. It's connected to all the stuff we said before about the history.
I would say that there are multiple reasons why MGTOW would raise an eyebrow, and one of the reasons it would raise an eyebrow is because there's a tendency of some people in the community to validate arguments made by the Southern Poverty Law Center, even though they shouldn't. Like, we MGTOWs could easily defend most arguments the Southern Poverty Law Center makes against us being a hate group, but we can only do that if we don't have people sabotaging us and people within the community doing what they can to prove the Southern Poverty Law Center correct.
So then that raises. Go ahead, sorry.
And that's kind of the problem we have, because it is these people who would harm any kind of defense of MGTOW being a hate group. And I would also like to point out that you cannot realistically blame everything on outside factors. So eventually, if these eyebrows keep being raised, and if you know that there are certain people who contribute to that, you're eventually going to have to start looking inwards and going to see who exactly in the community is the problem.
I mean, it's another an interesting point, and there's a lot of sense to it, right? But I would just say again, like, why, in my mind, the obvious, if you've, as you correctly identified, if you're frustrated with people who are supposedly part of the same group as you, but clearly just go around saying misogynistic stuff, are ruining the name you're giving yourselves, maybe say, okay, well, we're gonna cut off the man part. That sounds like a strange way of saying that. We're going to reword our organisation, or movement, or not even a movement. Just we're not going to we're not going to make it so overtly gender. We'll just say, we're people that aren't in relationships, or the people that have chosen to remain single, and you wouldn't even need to necessarily, like, you would in fact free yourself a little bit from some of the trappings that gendering things in this manner
I would say one thing. It's that in terms of men and men going their own, I don't necessarily think men-oriented spaces is necessarily a bad thing. But the second is regarding the name. I feel like the use of the name by those bad actors is illegitimate. So I would feel like, let's say, surrendering the name MGTOW, for example, to the trans trans folks. I would I would be tempted, as I often was for years, that such a stance would be defeatist and would ultimately even be dishonorable, because you would be giving them a free victory, and it means they get to do whatever they want with the label, and basically everyone who has the label is not going to be painted under their brush. So I also thought that surrendering the label "men going their own way" to the transphobes would also be extremely humiliating, because, in my opinion, they deserve nothing, and surrendering that label is still giving them something. That also applies to all the other phobes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that they didn't deserve anything, but my point would more just be like, instead of having the sort of gender term of men in there, like you could, because like if a as you said earlier, right, like it's not that you personally, and I'm sure your friends and such, don't believe that you can't be friends with different genders and different groups and whatever. Like you don't believe in any of the. We haven't even touched on the like weird racist people that you've got. Like,
Actually, I'm just going to say that guy. About that guy. That guy who's spewing that kind of thing doesn't even claim to be MGTOW, yet tries to poach people from it to do his own splinter thing. It's something that I haven't yet gotten around to, but what I can say about MGTOW and racism is that there has always been a consistent opposition to it, because the viewpoint of MGTOW is that a divided house cannot stand against itself, and that MGTOWs of all colors should stick together under one banner. This has been the historical viewpoint in MGTOW, and the viewpoint that still exists today, and this one I still 100% defend, as I have defended it in 2019, 2020, 2021, and onwards until now, and I still defend it.
and so there's something like that I can agree with in there somewhere, but like it's if you can, like you say, all stripes and all colours and all that and such. So then why why not all genders? Why keep the man pie is what I'm sort of trying to.
Because the way we see it is that there's still some kind of value in there being a men's rights thing, except where we can make it so it's not co-opted. However, one would also make the same argument as to why call something feminist and not say egalitarian in terms of gender equality. Now I understand exactly why, but you can also say that egalitarian sounds like the nicer label, but there's also some kind of historical reasoning as to why the label feminist is used to describe gender equality, and for example, why MGTOW as a label could still be workable were it not for the present troubles, which, by the way, didn't exactly exist in the past.
I mean, it's a relatively like new thing, isn't it? Or not? Well, I say new, like it's obviously been around for a little bit, but
Well,
it's
feminism is roughly 100 years old or so, if not 200. I'm not sure exactly when it started,
well,
but it's
there were
older
still
than we
people.
are for sure.
Yeah, of course, but the idea of feminist discourse and such is older than just the labeling of it as feminist. In terms of like, it's not as though I think that's I think the central thing. Like, men are not like inherently just in a better place, because there's all sort of intersectionality would give us all sorts of lenses to look at how people are affected and such, and even as we explore, there's lots of things which affect everyone and our systems and such. The issue is the framing of it as in the way that is done in MGTOW, men's rights spaces and such, implies there is some structural thing out to get men, which leads into the conspiratorial stuff that you've gone against and such. But what I was more trying to say, and I will in a minute go to the chat to get a question or two. I think it's one question that is here today. But what I get for doing a late stream.
I don't
Yeah,
think
what?
there's a lot of activity in the chat, which is surprising. I thought there would be more.
It's not popular enough. No, it varies. Like my humble little channel isn't. I'm not expecting tons and tons, but we've got a few. I had more in the last few streams I did, but
Your channel is generally close to being the size of my channel, with my channel being slightly larger, which is also why I was kind of okay with the stream happening on my channel for purposes of exposure and whatnot. But there's also one tangent I would like to add about patriarchy and returning to it.
go ahead.
And
Yeah, and then
also
we'll do the last chat
privilege,
question.
and also the terms of privilege. The reason why things like male privilege or white privilege as terms are unpalatable is because it sounds like they're benefit of one side over the other, which many white people or men do not feel. However, that doesn't mean the argument is necessarily wrong. For example, if you were to return to patriarchy, just because men have a small cake, you don't make that cake larger by taking away the entire cake from women, by giving women nothing and giving men a small sliver of something. Technically, that would be privilege, but it wouldn't be beneficial. So when people say that they should return to the patriarchy, they're basically saying that we should improve men's material conditions by making the material conditions of other groups even worse, which is basically how privilege as an idea works, in my opinion. And
Yeah,
that's the
is it?
reason why that's the reason. The problem with explaining things like privilege is that it's not explained in an easy enough idea such that right wingers can easily attack the idea by pointing out to the present day and saying, "Do you feel like you're privileged now?" or something like that.
Yeah, it's not. I think, as you say, right, like it makes a lot of people a bit uncomfortable and upset sometimes discussing it. I think that it's also very just intentionally distorted by people. Like a lot of bad faith actors intentionally muddy the waters and make all sorts of they're saying that nothing ever goes wrong in your life, or whatever, if you're a man, or if you're white and stuff. So it definitely doesn't help when there's bad faith actors circling around, but the concepts that are still, as you just explained, right? Like they still apply, and and I think intersectionality is really useful in terms of analysing these sorts of things, because it lets you see that people exist in multiple dimensions rather than just like a one or two obvious ones. But it's still I think worth talking about, and I do still think as well that there isn't if people were able to take a more left wing approach with it all, more progressive, more intersectional, and maybe one which moves away from the traditional sort of certainly slapping men in the title and stuff, that it would be much easier to dissuade and deconstruct and reject the conservative movements that have arisen and such.
One of the problem I would say in terms of general politics, not even related to MGTOW, is that progressives tend to have, and especially the woke one era, they tend to have a really bad time explaining their ideas. So conservatives, owing to the fact that they tend to have simpler sounding ideas, they explain things better than the progressives, which means that even if the progressives are more objectively correct, they lose because the more simple-minded conservative nature in terms of conservative marketing wins out in the end. Obviously, the idea of privilege being one huge example, like you can say that it exists, but progressives have had a really bad time trying to explain how it works.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think that in the sense that conservative ideas are normalised in the sort of the systems we have, because of course they are, right? Because you're to be progressive, to pursue progress, you're moving on from what has come before, which is ingrained. You're challenging the status quo. So of course, to people, to a lot of people, certainly, the status quo is easier to understand than what is new, and so it's easy then for a conservative backlash to happen. And certainly that's the case in a lot of cases. But I don't think it's a given that people are just like reticent to change. I think that actually, like, there's a lot of people that the ideas of, societal bigotry makes perfect sense to. It's not really that hard to imagine that societies which less than 100 years ago had legalized slavery and segregation and women couldn't vote and gay people were medicalized. It's not hard to believe those societies still have systemic problems with bigotries. And so I don't think it's what sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, but what I was basically trying to explain is that you can easily explain the idea of white privilege to, let's say, black people. What you cannot explain easily is white privilege to white people, because a white person or something isn't necessarily going to feel privileged, even if you can say that the terms of white privilege are correct, simply because they would look at their own material conditions and think, what privilege? And that's what the conservatives would latch onto. So that's the point I was trying to make. So
yeah, no, I understand that, but it's like the building of intersectionality, empathy, and awareness, and obviously they're all things that conservatives like to dissuade from. The one thing I would just say, just before we do go on to this chat, and I will let you say what you're going to say, but we are getting to that 2-hour mark.
I'm okay with reading chat comments if that's what you want. I feel like I've explained the part of the errors of progressive PR just as much as there is some kind of PR issue with MGTOW.
Yeah, it was just going to be to touch on woke just briefly. Obviously, it's another word which has become a bit of a buzzword and a bit sort of just everyone's just saying it for a lot of different things. It is worth stressing that it was, originally a word that came from African American circles, right? Like the idea, you like that. Let's say you're having a hard time in life, you're struggling and such, but you are aware that it's not your individual failings as a person, but the systemic racism that is endemic in America. The American structure is built on very obvious and blatant racist ideas. Chattel slavery and segregation and Jim Crow, all of that. And so you are awake or woke to this discrimination. And then as it was then introduced on social media, as it's people in those circles used it online, it then became a bit of a thing for any sort of being aware of any social discrimination, and so then it's re-characterized and turned into a pejorative by derogative by conservatives, and then now we get to now where it's like.
Yeah, but that is something I want to mention. I actually have known of this story of how woke as a term originated, but it's not something that most people know, because most people, especially in right-wing spaces and even some in left-leaning ones, have only ever known woke as a synonym for being progressive.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the point we were making, right? Like, because if you're critiquing the status quo, you attract the ire of conservatives. And so they are always going to make issues and fun and derogatives of any critical thing, because that's what they do. They have a vested interest in protecting the status quo. They're conserving the status quo, hence they're being conservatives.
Exactly,
so
name.
Yeah, no, exactly. So there was a question for you, actually. We Are So Back says, is this dude, meaning you, progressive MGTOW? Interesting if so. Would you say you're a progressive person?
I would say I would sort of lean to that direction, but I would I'd mostly describe my ideology as being sort of MGTOW first versus basically advocating in the interests of MGTOW, not in the interests of conservatism or anything else. But I would say that MGTOW first itself, it sounds progressive because it's not co-opted by conservatism. But I would say in terms of progressive issues like trans rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and also some kind of environmental viewpoints as well as the Ukraine issue, I'm basically for all of these things. And in terms of Ukraine, I would prefer to see a Ukrainian victory.
Well, and me too, right? Like, we can obviously identify the horrid.
So if you want to describe me as a sort of progressive, you could say that, but I've basically come to my conclusions independent of the progressives and independent of what people would call modern day woke, which is interesting how we have similar viewpoints, but we've arrived at those viewpoints completely independently of each other.
I mean, we've got the same access to the same stuff, right? Like, and like I said a minute ago, I feel like, for one, many of the things that you've said in this stream could. Oh, my earphones fell out. Then hold on. Been falling out all stream actually. I need to wear my headphones next time. The things that some of the stuff you've said in this stream would be considered woke by some people, right? Like it's used in such a flippant way today, precisely because
I've been called woke numerous times before.
No, exactly, because it's even though the things the things you've said, or many of them have been correct and agreeable and positive. It's a tool. It's something that conservatives attack, so it becomes something that is turned into a negative. Oh, you're woke, as though it's like some dirty evil thing, which is the sort of point that we're making, right? Like because especially when you're using the MGTOW stuff, like it's the space of a lot of people that don't like the idea of progression, and so come up with attacks for progressive ideas, namely the co-option of woke into a slur. I would also say if progressive is something that you're aligned with, maybe you could progress to not using the M part of MGTOW. I feel like
basically from the viewpoint of MGTOW and from my point of MGTOW, what I basically am okay with is some kind of men's rights activism, but I want an actually successful and actually pragmatic pro men's rights idea and pro MGTOW idea. And traditional conservatism just isn't the way. And what you might not get, but what I basically saw it as MGTOW is ultimately the culmination of progress from patriarchy and feminism to something new. Like patriarchy is what I call the old system, feminism is the in between, and then MGTOW for men is what comes after as the new way of doing things. So basically, and regarding whether or not you call yourself MGTOW, there's going to come a point in society where, like, a good chunk of Gen Z men are going to be single and thus could be considered MGTOW, but they're not going to call themselves MGTOW. So basically, there will be a point in time where you won't need this specific label because the specific label would just describe what society is like at that point. So we're headed towards that future.
But why, if people are single all the time, right? Like, but why would it be? Why they need to go their own way? Like, why? Like, it could just be single and that would be bad. Like, I think that would be the logical response.
Basically, MGTOW originated, and that's going to be in my upcoming video, at a time where being single was the aberration and not the norm. And now we're going to be having a time, at least especially among Gen Z men, where being single is going to be the norm, and not necessarily due to incelism or whatever, but because this is going to simply be the new norm. So in the modern reality where it's the new norm, you wouldn't need a term other than say normal to describe it, but MGTOW existed in a time where the institution of marriage was far stronger, far more capable, and where marriage was simply expected in society, and that expectation is going to go away. And that's one of the things I would also like to add, because I've also viewed the weakening of heteronormativity as also indirectly benefiting MGTOW. And the reason for that is that heteronormativity pushes for marriage. MGTOW obviously doesn't like marriage. So a weakening of heteronormativity means a weakening of the pro-marriage position, which would directly benefit MGTOW. Directly or indirectly, it depends. But if you have that weakened, MGTOW basically becomes strengthened.
I mean, you can reject the institution of marriage without rejecting relationships and, the idea that you'd need to go your own way. And you can also reject heteronormativity by doing the same, right? It's a curious one. But I feel like we are, treading on stuff we've spoken about. I'm happy to continue this discussion at some point on your channel. But I do.
Yeah, and that's what I would mention. I feel like the real question is whether we think the label is worth using, and whether or not we like the men's rights activism and the pro-male position that this label would necessarily imply. Because in terms of the actual policy things, in terms of the viewpoints, we happen to have similar viewpoints, but the discussion is whether or not we like this particular label and framing of said viewpoints. That's how it appears to me. Feel free to tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, there's an element of sensible stuff there, right? Like the idea that the framing and such, and who is being prioritised and who's being advocated for and such. Some of the points I don't really agree with, and I think there is that important, not just sort of distancing oneself from the negative elements, but also sort of like actively. I mean, it sounds like there's an element of you doing that already, but like the active, not just rejecting of the like bad misogynistic parts, but sort of almost like critically understanding why they are attracted to this movement in particular, but other sort of similarly aligned things, which would then explain why there's that labelling from like Southern poverty as negative and such. But we are going to have to continue this another time because I am my energy levels are really draining.
I wasn't going to say that you and I completely agree on everything. We obviously have our disagreements. But what I was going to say is that we have common ground, and in this live stream, I do think it was a productive discussion. I did try my best to answer most, if not all, of your questions.
Well, no, it was a nice chat, Igor, and I'm happy to certainly be fine having another chat at some point in the future. But I will end the live part of the stream now, so if you're watching, thank you. There's currently 6 of us.
Thank you for watching this channel and for hearing me out. I haven't spoken to this audience before, so if you liked it, I'm glad.
Awesome.
That's my message to the audience.
Well, no, it's a nice message, and we'll have to, like I say, we'll have to do a second part on your channel at some point. But no, I'm going to end the live stream now. Thanks everyone who listened, and take care all.